What's a dark part of American history that gets no attention in schools? The Tuskegee syphilis experiment was pretty fricked up. African American men were told they would get free treatment, but instead were left untreated. Do scientists could study the progression of untreated syphilis? Native American civil rights and the fact that they weren't even considered U.S. citizens until the 1920s, or Standing Bear v. Crook in 1879, which declared Native Americans human according to the law, and in which Standing Bear made a legendary civil rights speech, stating that hand is not the color of yours, but if I prick it, the blood will flow, and I shall feel pain. The blood is of the same color as yours. God made me, and I'm a man.
N.
The Battle of Athens, 1946. Long story short, veterans returning from WW2 had to take up arms to stop corrupt politicians from committing election fraud to stay in office. The beginnings of the city of San Francisco are pretty nasty. During the gold rush, the entire city was basically lawless and the only women in town were prostitutes. There were pirates, murders, lynchings, etc. etc. At one point the US Army nearly invaded the city. The entire city was burned down twice over by pirates. If anyone is interested, a great book about San Francisco, The Barbary Coast, an informal history of the San Francisco underworld by Herbert Asbury also wrote Gangs of New York. The Ludlow Massacre, where the Colorado National Guard on behalf of a coal mining company murdered 2 dozen striking coal miners and their families at their makeshift tent colony, Operation Ajax, otherwise known as the Iranian coup of 1953, where the CIA, at the behest of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Co., now known as BP and Standard Oil, overthrew the Prime Minister of Iran for nationalizing the Iranian oil fields. The overthrow of the Guatemalan government under President Jacobo Arbenz. Arbenz started a popular land reform program in which the government repossessed a bunch of unused land from the United Fruit Company, presently known as Chiquita Banana Co., for a value that the company wasn't happy with. They paid them the value that the company had been claiming on their taxes for years, a purposefully lowball value used to cheat their taxes, mind you. When the Guatemalan government refused to pay up the ridiculous sum that United Fruit wanted, they had the State Department stage a coup to overthrow Arbenz and install a government that was more friendly towards US interests, COINTELPRO, in which the FBI actively surveilled and attempted to blackmail, sabotage, and, in some cases, murder prominent civil rights activists. There are plenty of very dark, interesting and seemingly relevant events in American history that we should teach in our history classes. But these are just a few of my favorites. Edit. Almost forgot. The bonus Army March on DC, where thousands of WWI veterans marched on and subsequently camped out in DC because the US government cheated them out of their bonus pay for enlisting during WWI. The US government responded by sending the US Army in to disperse the veterans. 2 died, 1,000 were injured. Growing up in Hawaii, we learned a ton about the annexation of the Hawaii by coup d'etat and of the Japanese internment camps during WWII. I'm not sure how common learning that is compared to mainland schools. The Tulsa race riots are pretty commonly ignored in civil rights and Oklahoma history. Lived in Oklahoma for most of my life. Took Oklahoma history and it wasn't mentioned. You know what was mentioned? Native Americans, not in Oklahoma, but in everywhere, before they moved to Oklahoma. Then the last 2 weeks of the class we discussed Native Americans in Oklahoma and the land run. End of course. Never learned of the riots till my dad was just randomly browsing Wikipedia and stumbled upon it and showed it to me. Native American disenfranchisement. Children were taken from their parents and put in boarding schools, haircut and Americanized to destroy culture. Cultura. It's weird to realize that every so often, the conspiracy theorists may actually have a point. I'm not one of them, but when you read up on what the CIA gets up to when they have little supervision and a blank check budget, well. I'd also add the NRO to that National Reconnaissance Office. Eugenics and the sterilization of minorities. The US colonization of the Philippines. I was taught in schools the Spanish gave the Philippines to the USA. More like the Spanish left. The Philippines thought they should be independent, and we came in and kicked ass. One of my history profs in college said we would take rebels and stick a hose up their ass and fill it with water until it was coming out of their throat and the people would drown. Nonetheless, a very un-American activity. The Tulsa race riot is almost entirely forgotten in a single day. A white mob burned the most affluent black community in America to the ground. They were dropping firebombs from goddamn airplanes. It was a literal war zone, and you almost never hear about it in textbooks. The 1921 event was commemorated for the first time in 2010. Someone get Ava DuVernay on this screenplay. This is a movie America needs to see. Missouri Executive Order 44, also known as the Extermination Order of Missouri Governor Biggs. He pretty much made it legal to hunt and kill those affiliated with the Mormon Church. Led to the Horns Mill Massacre. 21 people killed. Other events led to more killings. The Stonewall Riots. You hear about the civil rights movement all the time, but they just so conveniently happen to leave out that one section of it. The decimation of native cultures that occurred before settlers arrived in North America. We act like the British showed up at Jamestown and Plymouth Rock and everyone had always been living in bark huts in small bands, ignoring the fact that smallpox and other diseases had swept up from Mexico and the Caribbean a century before, and the settlers essentially arrived after an apocalypse. We also gloss over the massacres that happened afterwards, but at least they were mentioned. The idea that North America as the British found it had always been that way forever and ever was always taken for granted. The border wars between Missouri and Kansas. I learned very little of it in a Missouri school. After graduation I crossed state lines into Kansas and learned that it was a big part of history class for Kansas students. Our past and present colonialism. I never once heard anything about Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Panama, or pre-Cold War Cuba in history class. The Compromise of 1876. The Republicans really wanted the presidency, but the Democrats were slated to win. So the Democrats said, we'll give you the presidency if you remove all the American troops occupying the South. So they did, and they did. This compromise allowed the South to restart slavery, wage slavery this time. Much easier if you can get your workers to pay for their own room and board. Multiple lynchings of elected black politicians, lots of Jim Crow laws enacted to disenfranchise black voters, and the rest is history. A word. The atrocities inflicted by the Japanese during World War II. I felt I learned about the Holocaust of the Jews at a very young age, but didn't hear about what happened in China until college. Most of these answers really depend on your history teacher. I had extensive lessons of all of these in my school and we didn't exactly have an education program that was winning any awards. A lot of Native Americans owned slaves / supported slavery / fought for the Confederacy. The narrative now is that the Native Americans were victims and it's a good accurate narrative that should be taught, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't acknowledge their participation in our rather horrible legacy. Iran-Contra. Also, I think these days it'd be pretty important to teach kids about the Mujahideen and the origins of Al-Qaeda, so they know where modern Islamic terror groups started. Vietnam and Korea are never done right, and it's important to really go deep into the civil rights, women's rights, and gay rights movements. Japanese internment should be taught. Also, just generally, while off topic, we really need to learn more about Asia, South America, and Africa. American students are woefully uneducated about the histories of very large and important parts of the world. I just learned in a college course about a failed revolution in South Texas in the early 1900s. A bunch of Tejanos ethnic Mexicans rose up to try to reclaim the land from the American Anglers, and the Texas Rangers murdered the shit out of them, along with anybody who looked or talked like them. Texas Rangers are a fricked up institution. Even teachers don't know about this. I once mentioned something about the Republic of Texas to my business teacher, and she told me that I shouldn't trust Wikipedia. She actually refused to believe that Texas used to be its own country. As a teacher, I can say that the standards we have don't really address how brutal we were to Native Americans. I also know quite a few teachers who try to make the Civil War more about states' rights than slavery, but I'm teaching in the South, so that could be part of that. Not dark, but the US motto, E pluribus unum, meaning out of one, many, actually stems from a poem attributed to Virgil, who was describing a type of cheese, garlic and herb spread similar to pesto. How violent and cruel the Puritans actually were, and our treatment of Native Americans. It seems a lot of our history books focus mostly on the enslavement of African peoples, and gloss over many of hardships faced by the incredibly diverse Native American peoples. Or edit. Poor white men in the US didn't have the right to vote until 1856, 14 years before black men, and 64 years before war. Many narratives imply that white men have always had a vote and denied it to others, but historically only the wealthy had control of government. Edit. Universal manhood suffrage began earlier, in the West about 1820, and wasn't nationwide until 1856. Edit 2. Math. How the Kill the Gays bill Uganda is directly related to America televangelists that were feeling the white man's burden bug and decided to bring their fricked up ideas about sexuality to Africa. Now all we talk about in schools is how some countries aren't as tolerant of homosexuality, but we never talk about how America fricked up their history so we can pretend that we're so progressive when we actually screwed over so many people's lives. It has to be the various eugenics programs and the atrocious way we have treated the mentally ill. Even up to this day, we talked about the mentally ill very lightly in school, but never talked about the full scope of what happened and continues to happen to this day. It is horrific. There is no other way to describe it. Horrific. I'ma lump gay rights into this as well. Proud to say I covered most of it in my course. Almost everything listed on this thread was covered. I didn't want my students feeling I hid something from them when they took it in college. I take teaching history, all of history, very seriously. I'd say the anti-Catholic, anti-Irish hatred surprised them. So did the Red Summer of 1919, Tulsa race riots, how widespread and open KKK membership was in the 1920s. Forces Texas State Fair had a Klan Day, the sundown towns, imperialism, the colonization of the Philippines, and labor conditions and violent reaction to strikes were eye-opening too. The Us Vincennes incident, Operation Ajax, how horrible Columbus was to the Arawak Indians, the role of slavery in the Texas Revolution, Jimbowie was a slave smuggler, and the lies that led to the Mexican-American War also were disturbing. Anyone that really knows American history knows how silly and historically ignorant a slogan like "Make America Great Again" is. Going to school in Texas, we were taught at a young age that the Civil War was about states' rights rather than slavery.